Oh, let's get going.
Well, welcome to our discussion about ethics and storm chasing with Dr. Jason Persoff. I'm Jackie Glover, professor of pediatrics in the Center for Bioethics and Humanities, and I direct the clinical ethics mission of the center. And this is really exciting for me. It's really out of my
Comfort zone.
No, I don't know. If you haven't seen Dr. Persoff's pictures in our art gallery, even before this or after this, I would welcome you and encourage you to come to the center and see his pictures. And so our guest is Dr. Jason Persoff. He's an internationally renowned storm chaser, father of 3 amazing forces of nature. I love that. Husband to his soulmate, erstwhile stand-up comedian, and contemporaneous associate professor of internal medicine at the University of Colorado. And briefly, his full biography is in the gallery, but I will turn it over to Dr. Persoff for a brief introduction, and then I have questions in interview style. And if you're online, put your questions in the chat or your comments in the chat. And we have some people in the audience. We welcome your dialogue after the formal interview. But if there's a question of clarification, we can interrupt for clarification. So, Jason.
Yeah. Why storm chasing, huh?
Well, do you have a...
I do. In fact, we're going to go to a slide presentation. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsor. Actually, there is no word from our sponsor, but here's the here this is, and David's going to cue us up here. So this is Jackie's and my presentation today. I'm just going to go over for a very short period of time a little bit about storm chasing, and then we're going to get into some of the ethical dilemmas that storm chasers, particularly healthcare professionals who chase storms, may encounter. And then, of course, we'll open it up, as Jackie said, for questions. So what is a storm chaser? Well, most of us are amateur meteorologists with enough enthusiasm that we drive endless amounts of miles to try and document severe weather. We have a fundamental knowledge that must include understanding the anatomy and physiology of storms. So when we talk about the anatomy and physiology of storms, it's important to understand the meteorology and the physics that are involved in order to be safe in this hobby. It also includes being able to understand geographic terrain very carefully, because not all roads continue straight. Some of them dead end into rivers, some of them aren't roads. And knowing where to find an exit strategy is always very important. The reality is that most of storm chasing is driving thousands of miles with heavy frustration. If you've ever been at the grocery store and thought you could predict which lane was going to be the quickest, you will experience the storm chaser's dilemma when multiple storms pop up that you pick one that you think is going to be the one, and everyone else scores and you're still in line 20 minutes later for the person with the third party out of state post-dated check. So it's all of that, but the bouts of amazement make it worth it. So just to give you an idea, we're very technically nerddom, basically. Those of us who like stats and being able to create 3-dimensional atmospheric maps and understand soundings and sort of how storms are put together, that's what allows us to chase storms well. And so I'm going to go ahead and do this video just to tell you why I love this hobby so much. So what you're actually watching, and just so you know, I am definitely a photographer. I am definitely not a videographer. So hopefully you won't get too sick from motion sickness here. But this is kind of the pinnacle of what we chase when we're chasing storms. This storm took place in Campo, Colorado, which is on the southeast corner of Colorado, abutting the Oklahoma border. And what you're seeing is a funnel coming down, a very laminar funnel is what we would call that, reaching from the sky and coming down to the ground. Now, what makes this so extraordinary is this particular tornado right there. This particular tornado was very courteous. I was out of position that day in Goodland, Kansas, just 2.5 hours away from this target. The storm had formed, looked like it was in a good environment, so I drove 2.5 hours. The storm didn't move. got out from underneath it. This is being filmed from the Oklahoma border. And then this happened. So this is kind of like one of those amazing moments in storm chasing where everything comes together. It's this incredibly classic, we talk about the Wizard of Oz tornadoes. This was definitely the Wizard of Oz tornado. And a picture of this particular tornado is actually in the gallery itself. So you can see it just has this incredibly beautiful funnel. And the other thing that's really neat about this is it barely moved for 25 minutes and it did no damage except to a small outbuilding, which it devastated, but otherwise was nearly stationary. And this is what we chased. Matt?
Is this real time or is
That's
it
real time.
sped up?
That's not sped up. This is real time. Yeah, I mean, it was a remarkable experience, probably one of the best experiences of my life. And this is what we try to chase. Now, here's really cool. You'll see it's doing what I call barber poling. You can actually see the dust is going up like barber pole bands around the tornado. That's not very common to get to see that kind of structure. Just really a phenomenal moment. And storm chasers work very hard to get to those areas. Now, the other benefit we have is we can report back to the National Weather Service what we're seeing on the ground, which helps improve their warning systems. But most of us aren't doing this for the science or necessarily for public service. We'll talk about that more, I'm sure, today.
How far away are you?
I am only about 3/4 of a mile away from that tornado. And people often say, why aren't I running away? Well, if you'll notice, it's moving very slowly from left to right. I'm not at any risk. I'm actually in sunshine at this point, filming that particular tornado. So tornadoes are kind of cool. They are definitely what most people think of when we think of storm chasers. Jackie's laughing at me, which I don't blame her. But when you see something like this, that's absolutely magnificent over open fields, it's true wonderment. This particular storm was Dodge City, which was in May 24th, 2016. And this particular storm was gigantic. It had tops up to 50,000 feet when you consider that that's maybe twice the size, almost twice the size of Mount Everest, all of it in water vapor and all of it creating these incredible images. And tornadoes can be great and small. They can be really neat. And actually, one of the cool things for most storm chasers is most of us can recognize each other's pictures as being from a specific tornado. Tornadoes have personalities that are very unique to that, which gets back to understanding the anatomy and physiology of storms, but not all things are tornado related. So for example, one of the things I love to get is lightning. This is what's called a bolt out of the blue. And this term actually was coined because on very powerful storms, lightning can shoot out up to 20 miles horizontally out of the storm cloud. And this notoriously happens up in the Rocky Mountains during the summertime, where a storm can be over one valley. A lightning bolt can shoot over the peak and then strike in the second valley where there is no storms. That's what a bolt out of the blue is called from. Or you could see this beautiful sight. I absolutely love this photo, and what you can barely see, but hopefully you can appreciate, there's a flock of sandhill cranes up above a field of rapeseed, which is just beautiful yellow in the springtime. So many of us chase for these types of images, these moments that are sublime and ethereal, and that's capturing that and sharing that with others so that people can have a little bit of wonderment is sort of what I consider my role as a chaser. So here is, this was 2 years ago. This was in Amarillo, right after a tornado had touched down just west of there. And I just love the fire and ice kind of view of this particular storm. This is also southwest of Lubbock, and this was what we call a low precipitation storm. And what I love about it is it just captures this grandeur of these rotating columns of air with water vapor condensing. That's the essence of storm chasing. And not all storm chasing works out to be like this. There are people who chase for various different reasons, to capture video, to capture stills. Some people just to actually experience this. I have nightmares, literally, that I am at a storm and can't get my camera to work. And then I go to my iPhone and I can't get the iPhone camera to work. My wife laughs at me whenever this happens, but they're very stressful because if you could see what I was seeing in my, but anyway. And so there's that. And then things like this, these incredible sunsets and skyscapes that only happen around severe weather and thus for me are magical. And like I said, very ethereal. Most of these photos capture a storm often right before collapsing and no longer being photogenic. And if I don't get myself to the right space and the right time through forecasting and understanding the anatomy and physiology of the storms, I don't get to witness these incredible miracles. But we'll go ahead and end with that and go to the ethical divide and the many things that are associated with the ethics, bioethics of storm chasing.
So thank you very much. You have to come to the gallery and see this in person.
Or else.
Or else. I would call them spiritual. You said
Yeah, they are
ethereal.
for me.
It's so grand. But in conversation with you in preparation, I hear you concerned about storm chasing as a physician and a concern that you never forget your obligations as a physician. Some may be thinking, like I did, why do you do such a high risk thing in the first place? It's one thing to help people in need that you come across. Trouble comes to you, so to speak. It's something completely different to go looking for trouble. Is there anything inherently wrong with a physician engaging in storm chasing, looking for trouble?
Yes, looking for trouble. It does raise a very ethical question, which is placing myself at the scene of the crime. And I think for healthcare providers of any kind, this is an interesting question that I've had to deal with. So when Joplin was devastated by a tornado in May of 2011, I volunteered at the only working hospital at that time. There were two hospitals, one was devastated, and worked a 12-hour shift helping these victims from the tornado. And at the end of that shift, I transferred the care of my patients to an overwhelmed staff because I couldn't keep working. But this was their hospital, their people, it was a really emotional moment to hand those patients over, realizing that that I was leaving. And the reason that I was leaving wasn't just that I was exhausted and needed to get some sleep, which was definitely the case. It was also because there were other storms to chase down in Oklahoma. So did I do wrong by that? Did I choose my own selfish interests in order to chase? And the answer is very muddy. So one of the things that Jackie and I observed is you could make an argument that it is unethical for a healthcare provider to place themselves either in a position to be at risk, to be harmed, or to be showing up in places where people are harmed. And the rationale being, it's for selfish motives, right?
Yeah, there's no, you're a hospitalist.
I am.
You work in the ED. So when you were in Joplin, you were qualified and you felt that this is a need that I can fill. And you weren't selfish. You didn't consider what's the Good Samaritan law in Missouri? Am I covered if I get sued for being in this position? You didn't think that. You thought, I'm here. And if we said physicians have an obligation to not go seeking trouble, no, Matt, you can't go scuba diving, you can't go skiing. So it's really, you can't be a whole person enjoying the hobbies, can't be a photographer, can't be a mountain climber, you can't be a physician in Colorado. And I don't think that's a this is not a good argument. Yeah. So it's not blatantly unethical for you to be a storm chaser just because you're a physician. And I discovered a literature on this, believe it or not. I was surprised. Your colleague, you know well, Tony, wrote a graduate thesis for a Master's of Science in Media and Media Management called Tragedy and Ethics in Storm Chasing. He quotes another colleague of yours, Chuck Dogswell, in his influential work on storm chasing with safety, courtesy, and responsibility. So what do you see as the key features of ethical storm chasing?
So Tony Lubbock, who wrote that, and Chuck Doswell, who before him is one of the greats in storm chasing. They both together looked at sort of the general ethical principles of storm chasing. And part of that included being knowledgeable about what you're doing. So one of the biggest dangers that we definitely have seen, and it's grown in severity, is the comfort with technology has increased astronomically relative to the way it used to be. So here's where I'm a get off my lawn kind of moment. Back when I was starting storm chasing, there was no data in the field. You had to go to the National Weather Service office, look at maps, talk to forecasters, and then do your best to figure out how to get to the various locations where storms could be. It was very easy to miss tornadoes. It was very easy to miss any good photo opportunities because a lot of the data that you were working with is old. It got a little bit better when there was the Weather Channel. So we would go to hotels and motels and stop in their lobby because very often they would have live radar updates. Sometimes you'd have somebody, forecast for you. It was involved. Eventually we were using telephones for modems. I can not tell you the number of times I asked to hijack the credit card machine for its RJ11 jack, the jack that you use for telephones, to do a modem. Oh yeah, all kinds of things. And nowadays, of course, it's very easy to get radar applications on your phone, and you can get all the forecasting data you possibly want. And the net result of that, fortunately or unfortunately, is that more people are entering into the field thinking that they understand the complexities of storm chasing. While I definitely am a big fan of people being interested in science and weather, one of the biggest ethical problems we have is that people are not prepared when they go out there and are seeking very much for themselves the highest impact videos which sell money-wise. This is an expensive hobby. I mean, I hemorrhage money every year when I chase because the odds of me actually photographing something that somebody else would be willing to pay for is extremely small. And the market is very saturated with lots of good video and still photography. So a lot of people have gotten to the more extreme, and recently we've seen this development of what's called zero metering. And I went, and this is where I also sound like an old man. I'm like, what's zero metering, you young whippersnappers? It's these newer individuals who are going out there and trying to get within 0 meters of tornadic damage. And that means being extreme in how they approach things. And one of the concerns, of course, is I personally believe that if we are in a chasing community that promotes this, the people who are doing that are putting themselves in most of harm's way. And there's two sides to that I see. One is they are at risk of becoming a victim, especially if they're amateurish in how they approach this. And they can actually cause problems. So every time you add another body to the body count of injuries that are going on from a tornado, it adds a strain to the EMS system, to the emergency departments, to the rescuers. And then on the other hand, they also are passing tragedy and trying to capture that on video, which there is a journalistic role for that. There is a journalistic role, but most likely these individuals, some of whom I know, aren't doing it for the journalistic aspect. They're doing it for the sensationalism and for the sales and for the likes. The social media has made storm chasing very painful in a number of ways. It also promotes very frequently very dodgy behavior. We have lots of videos of people filming while chasing, which is not the problem. The problem is you can often see their speedometer in those shots exceeding 90 miles per hour, crossing double yellow lines to get where they are, driving very erratically in order to capture this. And so one of the things that Doswell and Lubbock both commented on was, is it respectful to be out there? Now, are there any rules or laws that state a storm chaser must have some sort of qualifications? I don't think that that's ever going to happen. I don't think that's worth happening, but it's a personal journey as to what your ethos is. So that was one of the arguments that they made is that piece. I have other concerns too, which is, I'm traveling through these country roads in very, very small towns. And while on one hand, storm chasers do provide tax dollars to these small towns as we fuel up our gas there and buy food and stop at the motels and stay there and eat restaurants, all of that providing tax dollars. Nevertheless, we wear out these roads faster for them. We cause traffic jams. And if you've never seen anything like it, when you're on a country 2-lane road that is barely gravel and there's a traffic jam for 2 miles because there's a bunch of storm chasers there. It is intruding on these people's lives. And so another question I think that comes up in my mind is, how can we as chasers be as courteous and responsible to the communities through which we're traveling as possible? And I remember being on a storm in just outside of Dodge City in 2016, where one of the storm chasers I know got out of his car and was begging the storm, screaming at the storm at the top of his lungs at a gas station to set down a tornado. And his enthusiasm for seeing a tornado was understandable, but it's kind of like you said, the quiet part loud. And not only that, but this kind of wish for something that these individuals who live there would not want is very troubling to me. So I think that does raise another ethical question, which is, how can you bring responsibility to the areas through which we're traveling? And for me, that looks a lot like traveling the speed limit, being very mindful of how I move my vehicle around these areas, trying not to cause any harm or damage to different country roads, being a responsible steward of the towns that we're in. And then the last piece to this got to at least Tony's take on things, and I think Dr. Doswell as well, was this idea of the media sensationalism. So the media aspects of this, where we're capturing people's misery. So this is, for me personally, and I believe for healthcare providers, you may think there's not that many, but believe me, there's a lot of healthcare providers who chase. I chase with
the ED,
not just in the ED. I chase with an allergist, which is really great because we're chasing during usually high pollen season, and that's really nice to have him on board. Sorry, Bill, but I've chased with other hospitalists, even the hospitalists from Italy, and there are a lot of nurses who chase, a lot of nurses, paramedics. So there's a whole spectrum of us. The question becomes, at what point in time do we put down the camera? And at what point in time do we become providers, trying to assist at the scene of potential devastation?
2 questions. One is, from my ignorance, isn't there an obligation to health science? Do chasers actually help? Is there a reason scientifically? Are you doing good by being there?
Oh, yeah, this is a wonderfully debated topic within storm chasing circles. So chasers do have a role where if they report severe weather to the National Weather Service and to local law enforcement, they're helping improve warnings for that area and also data gathering in that respect. Is it vital to the community that someone does this? No. It is helpful, but the weather radar has gotten extraordinarily good at identifying tornadic storms, but it's still helpful for the National Weather Service to get reports. But in terms of conducting science, very few are actually involved in true scientific endeavors, where one puts out a hypothesis and then generates the way they're going to gather data and then analyze those data and then produce those results. Many chasers claim to be doing science, such as sticking probes in the way of tornadoes to measure air pressure and things like this. This has already been done a bazillion times. It's not really science. They call it science so that they can justify why they're doing GoFundMes. Very interesting. One of the GoFundMes I saw was looking for a budget for this season. To do, I'm not even sure what their experiment was, like around $173,000, which is I'm very on this. If you want to donate $173,000, I will find some science in my storm chasing. Just write it in. We'll take it. But the reality is that they're not actually doing something of that sort. Now, there are storm chasers who do real science, and many of them are affiliated with NOAA or the National Weather Service and are contributing to our body of knowledge of how tornadoes form and and improving our warning systems. That does happen, but the common chaser claims that they're doing it for the benefit of mankind, but they're probably not doing it for the benefit of mankind.
I can hear the excitement in your voice when you say chaser. And I've heard you say it's not only providers, the nurses, the physicians, the other healthcare professionals that have an obligation to help. I've heard you say it's not only you that have to put down your camera and attend to people. You think it's an obligation of everyone that puts themselves in the way of a storm to call 911 if you're not a provider. Did I hear that correctly?
Good. I absolutely 100% believe that if you are a witness to somebody who's injured, you have a duty as a human being to be of service to them in some way, shape, or form. And I don't expect anybody who doesn't have training in first aid or comfort in that level to ever render first aid.
Right.
I don't want them to if they don't know what they're doing, but everyone can call 911. And that is extremely important that those calls occur because those people need help. And I think that's just being a good citizen.
And Tony talks about the story of Mark Farnick, who was in the town of Pilger, Nebraska on June 16th, 2014, immediately after a total of four EF4 tornadoes were spawned by a single supercell thunderstorm, including two which were on the ground at the same time, with one making a direct impact of the little town of Pilger, damaging or destroying 75% of the town. Farnick took pictures of a 5-year-old little girl who was one of the two who lost their lives in the tornado. It was a photograph of her being carried from the rubble on a stretcher as she looked lifeless. It was very controversial at the time, with people arguing that it was unethical and people arguing that it didn't take this picture and sell it and put it on the social media. But people were also arguing that it didn't technically violate any codes of ethics because he didn't interfere with any of the attempts to save her or work with her. What do you think about this and why?
Yeah, so this is a tough one. I know Farnick well. He's genuinely a good human being overall, but he does tend to play it pretty risky. The day of the Pilger tornadoes, Pilger was amazing because of the twin EF4 tornadoes down at the same time. They were huge and they were right next to each other. It was an amazing, awesome sight.
So you were there?
Oh God, no! I was licking my wounds because the exact same atmospheric setup had occurred 2 weeks before when I was out there, and not a single tornado formed, not a single one. So then they get the same atmospheric setup, and lo and behold, they get the Pilger tornado. It's just not fair. It's not fair, but it did do significant damage, and Farnick chose to take photos of that damage, which included, unfortunately, the lifeless body of a girl. The question about when do you become a journalist? And to be clear, there is a mandate to bear witness. I think there is a mandate to bear witness to what happens. We learned in the Holocaust that a lot of people chose not to bear witness to this humanitarian crisis. Bearing witness has a historical and I believe a very good ethical foundation. The question is, was it ethical and appropriate for a storm chaser who was literally there chasing storms to capture a photograph of a dying girl? Of course, if we think back to the Oklahoma City bombings, the most iconic photo of that day isn't just the F. Murrow building and its destruction. It's of a firefighter carrying a young child away from the daycare center, which was destroyed by the bomb. And it is an extraordinarily powerful image. And I think that image won the Pulitzer as well. So it was a very important image at the time. Is it our role to bear witness? Well, I think that to me, the ethical line is everything being done to your level of ability to assist the people that are in that situation to the level of your ability? If in fact you are unable to continue to give any further aid, either because you don't have the training or you're not qualified to do that, or you're not comfortable, is it okay to switch to a journalism type mode? And I actually believe that that is okay. There is a role for that. Now, making money off of those photos, that's a tougher sell. But the truth of the matter is, photojournalists are doing the same thing, except they're not doing it by the shot. They're doing it by being paid by the AP or their papers.
And with a commitment to a code of ethics
Correct.
in journalism. And the fact that he did not interfere with the rescue is only one part of the journalism code of ethics. Also being respectful. This is a small town. People knew that 5-year-old little girl. Did he ask permission to take? Other features of the journalism code of ethics. So this is only one. Have you seen things that you would clearly label as unethical? You have crossed a line and you shouldn't have done that. And if so, what are they and why?
So I think some of the things that I've seen based on video streams has been people driving right by a tornado damage with people screaming for help. And they just keep on going, and they just keep on going. They just ignore the other individuals. No attempt to call 911 and no attempt to help. Again, I don't fault people without training for not stopping and actually trying to help rescue individuals, because I feel very strongly you can actually become a victim yourself. In fact, studies have shown that people who rush into collapsed buildings and dangerous situations often become victims themselves, which then adds to the ethical burdens of the community in which they're there, because again, you're increasing the number of EMS calls that need to be done to take care of the person who got themselves into that situation. And then you're also overtaxing their health system. We see this a lot with like swift water rescue, where people fall into swift water and other people try to go out and pull them in, and then they get pulled in themselves. Well, that can happen. When we're talking about tornadoes, we're talking about live electrical wires very frequently, which are down, and people, can be electrocuted extraordinarily easily. Also live gas lines, so explosions can happen. So there is an actual argument for not going and helping people. And one of the things that I'll contrast this with, and then I'll answer your question, is that, one of the trainings that I had as an EMT, and one of the things which we continue to use as medical ethics, is the only scene that I can help at is the one where I'm safe. So I can't enter an unsafe scene, because then I jeopardize everyone else. And, you and I in our private conversations have talked about PPE during the COVID pandemic. So we had to tell everybody, especially during the early, before the vaccine, we had to tell people that if somebody went into cardiac arrest, you are not to go into that room until you are fully dressed in your PPE. And that is opposite of most nurses and doctors' instincts during a code event. So scene safety is very important. And so I think people are okay with not going into the scene. In fact, I often advocate not for doing that. Where I think they break down in their ethics is they speed past work. Another really big cardinal sin to me on storms is excessive speed. This is a major problem that we have. I'm not saying that speeding a little bit over the speed limit is a problem. We're talking about 90, 100 miles an hour or plus trying to get to that storm. We've had multiple storm chasers killed as a result of car accidents and lack of situational awareness. So again, this need to be proper stewards for the lands through which we travel. I think that it befuddles me when people not only don't pick up the phone to call 911, but then come back to video the damage. after the tornado has dissipated. It says something about the character, I think, when people do that. Now, I understand there's this thing that we talk about called the PG rated version. We call it stormgasm, because what happens is people are so caught up in the experience of the storm that it's very difficult for them to separate from the storm itself. And
Adrenaline.
the adrenaline's going, the
The front brain is not engaged.
No. This gets all the way down the amygdala. It's pure amygdala, and I get that. But nevertheless, these are some of the ethical issues we face.
So your colleague Doswell offers a more informal set of guidelines that you can find pretty thorough. If you're curious, I would recommend it. But he really bends over backwards to say, I'm not telling you you have to do this. These are not rules. I don't want to be the old man saying, but really, if there's more people doing this and professionals who are accustomed to codes of ethics, and you spoke to it, you didn't think it would be worthwhile to have a code of ethics for chasers. Can you elaborate on that? It seems to be a really tight-knit group. You knew everyone that I found in the literature.
Well, that's because there's those of us who are old and know each other. Yeah, there is generally a tight-knit group of chasers, but like I said, there's been an explosion of new chasers, many of whom I don't know. And, a lot of people do get off my lawn kind of philosophy about storm chasing. Should there be a codified set of ethics? Well, the hardest part about that is, looking at codes of ethics, when does that become a rule or a law? When does that qualify one person over another, and who is making the judgment of what is ethical? And I think that's always the problem, right? Is understanding the perspective of who is deciding this and who's coming up with this. So is it us old guys who have done this for a while and don't feel the need to be pumped on adrenaline all the time? Is it a community that comes together and says this? But what about the people who don't agree with this? I imagine it would be this way for many hobbies. It would be very difficult to come up with a code of ethics for knitting, although, and I think those needles are dangerous. I'll be honest. So that that's
the stand-up.
Yeah, right. That's right. That's right. But the thing is that I think that there's a dangerous risk there, and there have been people who have half seriously suggested that there be a license for storm chasing, and there's actually been efforts at legislation on this. So some of the really affected states, particularly Kansas and Oklahoma, have even looked at what can they legislate about making storm chasing illegal.
Interesting. There's laws about obeying the speed limit. So that's up to
Is there?
Yeah.
Not the way I drive, but no, I'm just kidding.
I'm going to ask you kind of a personal question. I'm curious. You're a busy physician. When do you do this? And you have a family, and you want to go on vacations other than storm chasing. So one, when do you do this? And what does your family think about this incredible hobby of yours?
Yeah, I like how you put incredible in quotes, even though you didn't put quotes or air quotes there. So I'm very lucky in that I have a very supportive family, but it wasn't always so. This took a long time of navigation. This is an expensive hobby. And I've had, my kids are older now, and two of them, of the three, love to storm chase, which is really cool. And so then you get into all these different things, like how do I negotiate that with a spouse, with my kids, and I'm taking a risk. So full disclosure, when I was out chasing a storm one time, not speeding on the highway, actually was driving slowly because it was really rainy, I ended up hydroplaning and flipping my car. And, the first conversation I had with my wife after telling her what happened and apologizing profusely is, I'm like, I bet you want me to come home now. And she said, no, that could have happened here. I mean, it wasn't like it happened that you were out storm chasing, but you could have hydroplaned here. It wasn't like I threw myself into the mouth of a tornado. But we do have cautionary tales. Tim Samaras was a gentleman who lived here in Colorado with his son and storm chased with another individual, and they were killed doing legitimate research on a tornado back in 2013 in El Reno, Oklahoma. So there is this recognition of risk. There's also the reality that one of the biggest threats, other than hydroplaning, that we experience as storm chasers is livestock. So cattle, horses, things like this, crossing the road, deer, all of these things. Car versus animal is a very common car accident chasing in the plains, particularly at nighttime, and particularly after tornadic storms, which can knock down fences and allow cattle to run onto the roadway. So again, it's this negotiation of how do I feel about that with my family? How comfortable are they with me taking that risk? And it's only with the permission of my family that I do go. But yes, my family knows that I prefer the last 2 weeks of May to be mine to wander the plains as I see fit. And then occasionally, if there's something nearby Colorado during other months. And that if there's no storms, then I get to be a family guy for 2 weeks. But if there's storms, I'm gone because they have a siren song on me.
So what advice would you give to the younger generation of storm chasers or people who said, this looks, your pictures, your photography is just awesome in the real use of awesome. I want to do that. What advice would you give them?
So the first and most important thing is respect the storms. So you can't,
The mountains.
yeah, exactly. You cannot win against Mother Nature. So it's very important to get some training in this. And there are a number of different opportunities. The simplest one is to sign up with the National Weather Service for a spotter course, where you can actually learn some of the anatomy and physiology of storms. There is a whole internet forum called stormtrack.org, which I highly recommend, which allows new people to come in and voice their questions, get help. There's lots of pointers, there's lots of things. And then last, go with somebody who knows what they're doing. This can be a storm chase tour. There are multiple tour companies out there, which I would highly recommend. And go on a tour so you can ask these questions, learn about how this is done and the various factors that factor into that. But you can't just go out and use a radar app and the National Weather Service to do this safely. You may get lucky a few times, but until you know how to actually map out your geography and escape routes, you really are putting yourself at risk. So I encourage everyone to enjoy the weather, but until you're willing to take those risks and understand what that means, keep in mind that a lot of insurance companies, if they know you're out storm chasing, may cancel your insurance on your vehicles. So you have to be really careful about these sorts of other issues too.
Are there questions from the audience or on chat, David?
Anna?
Can you press and hold?
Oh, did you have a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Persoff, I'm just curious how present the conversation of environmental racism is in this world, or just the impact of storms often affecting those who are in low-income households, maybe in shelters that aren't as able to withstand storms, and just curious how present that is for you and your community, especially as you mentioned it being such an expensive hobby, and just the dissonance that I'm personally feeling in that, and curious how present that is.
So I can tell you that there is a huge amount of I absolutely agree with the disparities, and the data back this up. So usually when we think about people who can't afford an apartment or a house, it's not uncommon for them to have a mobile home. Mobile homes are very dangerous, even though they're very affordable, in part because they aren't secured to a foundation. And so even though we talk about tornadoes being at high risk for mobile home parks, the reality is even the straight line winds around thunderstorms are sufficient to cause these particular homes to be destroyed. And it is a huge disparity. And when you look at the number of people killed in a major tornadic event, the people who have the lowest income are the ones that are disproportionately affected. And this can have racial overtones, of course, when we talk about redlining in different areas. Keep in mind that I'm chasing through what could be considered the South, which is the Midwest. And so there can be issues where poverty is going to be more likely to affect, for example, Mexican Americans, immigrants, and African Americans as well. So it's a huge deal. So yes, this is an expensive hobby. The only thing that it's hard to put those two things together, and I can't. My hope is that when we're in the community, we're spending money at their stores and trying to get not only taxable income, but also supporting local business. I always go local if I can. I never go to a chain place. I always go to, mom and pa's eatery to try and continue to provide income there. But that's a great question. We also know that tornadic storms tend to disproportionately kill very young and very old. And so that also is another demographic that's impacted by these storms.
Are there questions from the chat? Thank you.
Yes, so Rosa Lawrence is asking, risky leisure activities can be helpful to practice how to mitigate risk, behave under pressure, understand what is in and out of your control, etc. These all seem like valuable skills for healthcare providers. Do you see any crossover between the skills you've gained from storm chasing and your clinical practice?
Oh, excellent question.
That is an amazing question. So far, 2 questions hitting it out of the park. That is a great question. I especially love the things that are in your control and aren't. Storm chasing is very humbling because of that exact issue. Almost nothing is entirely within my control except me and my car. And one of the things that I've learned as a physician is that same thing is also true. I can only be my best self and do the best work that I can that day. And the rest is really up to the patient, and the outcome is not entirely up to me. If I'm a proper steward as a physician, then hopefully will affect the outcome I'm seeking, but it's not entirely up to me. The patient's body has to also be part of that. I think that the analogy that there are valuable skills, I think one of the things that my children have fed back to me, that they've had the experience of storm chasing, and I think it's very important skill of being present. Being present in the moment is something that they have picked up and have commented on, because I hammer it into them, that being present in the moment is very important, and also making good plans and decisions. And I do think there is a humility that comes from working in a high risk environment that can carry over to medicine. Do I think I want a bunch of healthcare providers out chasing to hone their skills? Probably not, but I think it's an interesting insight into people who are open to those experiences. So it's a great question.
Another online question, Jeremy Bauer says, always a pleasure to hear Dr. Persoff speak. Question, are there recent trends in storm chasing that you find more concerning than in the past? Example, distracted driving or social media?
Jeremy, well, you're a threat on social media. So I love you, man. Yeah, I think that the problem is distracted driving is a huge offender. And we had this back in the day. We used to have our huge laptops and TVs in our cars, so it wasn't like this is completely novel. But what is novel is the social media angle that is occurring. So the need for now, this information now, and the need to disperse information now is a huge problem. It means people are looking at their phones while they're also often doing multiple tasks, including driving. Now, I should note, when you're on a country road and you can see the road in front of you for miles and there's no crossing roads, you have a little bit of flexibility in normal driving behavior. The problem is you don't always know where those roads are going to cross, and you also don't know what sorts of things can spring up at last second. I have a famous moment when I was chasing a storm where I was pretty excited about the tornado, and I was on these rolling hills. And I just assumed the rolling hills were going to be the same distance apart, like a sine wave, piece of cake. Well, it turned out as I came over the crest of one of them, it bottomed out on a ditch that had absolutely no, there was nothing to cross that ditch. So I ended up doing this amazing Dukes of Hazzard moment where I flew over the top of it, and I was, airborne before I knew it. There was no time to react. So there's definitely risks with not paying close attention and being studious. The thing that I think is concerning is the need to nowcast and get that information out so that you're number one and that you're getting the likes and the monetary reimbursement. That didn't exist before. We used to have to peddle our video later on to the TV station when we got back in town. But I think that immediacy has actually increased the amount of distracted driving that's going on. And then the second thing, this stormgasm thing I'm talking about, it's very common, and I hate the term. I know, I'm sorry, Jackie, you cringed, but it is this moment of completely being absorbed into the high energy moment of storm chasing. And there's a lot of alpha maleism that comes out in that. And I think it causes people to be not only distracted, but so amped up that they can't make good decisions. And I think that's definitely being shown. It's only a matter of time before we see more storm chaser deaths.
I actually have a question as well. So we know that one of the kind of burgeoning effects of climate change is seeing these natural disasters and weather storms in greater magnitude and frequency going on. And as you mentioned, we know that a lot of these disasters tend to significantly impact those who are racially marginalized and in lower socioeconomic areas. As a provider and, you know, with the other healthcare providers that also storm chase, have you had any observations or commentary on how this might affect worsening kind of health disparities that we see, and how healthcare providers who do engage in storm chasing might be able to rectify some of the ethics surrounding that?
Another great question. It's very deep. Yes, I think one of the things that's very striking for the people who I chase with is I chase with several meteorologists as well. So one of the things we do talk about is the climate change and its impact. And I can tell you that we've seen climate change. So it's very difficult to draw on any one storm is not climate change. So if we see a devastating string of EF5 tornadoes busting through the Midwest, that has nothing to do with climate change. Now, where you see hurricane frequency and number, that has to do with climate change. But one of the things we definitely know that we're seeing with climate change is that, for example, we routinely, when I was growing up here in Aurora, had tons of tornadoes, landspout type tornadoes that would touch down around here. And that's a rarity. There was the one a couple of years ago that everyone could see up north that was just amazing.
People standing on the roof at
Yeah.
Children's Hospital looking.
Amazing. It was amazing.
David has a picture.
Oh, he does. and that, you know, but we used to get those routinely and see them very frequently. And over the past few years, I would definitely say we are not seeing them in Colorado as frequently. They have moved sort of east and somewhat north. So we can see the overall change that probably has its ties in climate. Where we're seeing more extremes are the droughts. One of the things that we're definitely seeing is the drought. Now, when we look at droughts, they disproportionately affect migrant workers who come to farms to try and help with harvesting, and also getting all of that harvest transported out of the areas where they grow. West Texas has been a dust bowl for the past few years in a way that I've never seen before. The rivers are extremely low. You know, the impact of climate change is here, though people don't believe it, and they keep pointing to, you know, well, this storm or that storm. Well, that's not the whole picture. What we're definitely seeing is that there's going to be more extremes in temperatures. For example, this year, Greenland, in the middle of winter, at a temperature of 70 degrees, whereas the west coast of the United States at that particular time in Washington state was around 20 degrees. That makes no sense. And these sorts of things are actually happening with more frequency. So we're going to actually see quite a change in how the water cycle works with the melting of the Greenland ice, which is happening at a higher number. In fact, there have been so many high temperature every single summer and every winter, there have been new high temperatures in the Arctic. A staggering thing. So one of the things we talk about is how do we mitigate that climate change? And we have to come up with better solutions than you know, fossil fuels for starters, but also looking at the impact. You know, most of us think that the wind impact and using wind and solar will solve things, until you start looking at they actually also have a huge carbon footprint in waste. You know, that the actual windmill portions of the windmill cannot be recycled, or they've not been able to find a good way to recycle it. So when one of those breaks down, a lot of those have been buried, the actual windmill winds. Now they're finding ways to recycle them finally, but we need to do better as citizens of that. And storm chasing gets a party foul because there's a lot of gasoline use. We're aware of that. And ideally we'll see more electric out in the field, but right now the long distances make that sometimes very difficult and challenging. Question.
Another Zoom question by Brian Jackson. What would you think about a fee for chasers that would pay toward rescuers, both for the chaser and for others who may need help after a tornado? Perhaps similar to search and rescue membership programs that some places have started using.
Very interesting question. So I can tell you that there is a lot of philanthropy within the storm chase community already. There is a set of videos that Skip Potter has done called Storm Assist. And there are lots of charitable organizations that people can voluntarily give to, which I do, such as to the American Red Cross. The problem with mandating anything is if there's one way you get people, and this goes back to this question of ethics, is the moment you start mandating things for people, the more cynical that they become. My hope is that people will recognize that they have a responsibility to give philanthropically to their communities, including communities in which they travel. The simplest way is to give to established organizations that are very, very helpful in disaster. The American Red Cross is probably one of your safest bets. I would recommend that over any fee, is that people consider that before they go out chasing.
I don't know how much time we have left for questions, but
Maybe one or two more.
one or two more. Okay. Another question from the UCH Spiritual Care. Do you participate in rescuing while/after chasing?
So I do not. And the reason I do not is I don't have the right equipment to do that. Now, I always chase with boots on, rugged boots, and I have some really great work gloves that can deal with broken glass and nails and things like this, but I'm not qualified to extricate people. If somebody can get extricated, I'm happy to set up shop. 2 days after Joplin, I was in central Oklahoma and actually set up with a mobile command center there near Chickasha, Oklahoma, where there had been 2 major tornadoes that day, and actually helped with triage and patients who were transported to that triage area. So yes, I do that, but I'm actually not a rescuer. And I recognize my limitations, but I'm willing to treat anybody on the scene. Time for maybe one more.
Right. This last question is, sorry if I butcher the last name, Dr. Joel Ajay from Dallas, Texas. I enjoyed your presentation, very fascinating. My question is, since storms are part of nature, have you thought of the spirituality of storms?
I think it's a perfect one to go out on. So I will share with you that everything is in the context of my spirituality, and I have a very strong spiritual bent. For me, the opportunity to have been given to see the storms that I have is one that I believe is from my higher power. And that by having a service mentality, I'm rewarded with the opportunity to see his wonders. Now, I don't believe that anybody else has to believe that at all, but it is hard not to be humbled in front of one of these storms and be amazed at all of the things that have to come together for these to happen, and that I get to be there for that. And not only that, there's an incredible experience, and I think many chasers experience this as well. As the sun is setting on one of these storms, and you can hear the crickets in the background, and it's quiet, and you can smell the fresh hay, and you hear the lightning, or you hear the thunder and see the lightning. And it's just, these moments are sublime, and they're deeply spiritual and filled with gratitude. I feel an immense gratitude that I have the opportunity to do this. For me, it's an intensely spiritual experience. Some of you who know me may find this sort of bizarre, but because I don't seem like a spiritual person necessarily in the way that I behave, but for me, that's my grounding is in my higher power. And I'm blessed beyond measure to have that opportunity and to share it with all of you. That means a lot to me.
From someone who is not the least entertained by endorphins. You have really opened my eyes to many aspects, including the beauty of what you are able to capture for people who would never chase a storm. Thank you so much, Dr. Jason Persoff.
Thank you all. And thank you all who were online. You can email me. The easiest way is jason@stormdoctor, stormdoctor.com. I welcome any questions that you guys have, and I hope you got something out of today. It was a pleasure to be with you.
And the show, Everyone is Unique, is open through next Thursday.
It's
so if you're going to come within the next 6 days. And info is on our website about access to the gallery.
Was this recorded? Is it available on Colorado Bioethics, David? Can you announce that? So this has been recorded and it will be posted on the center's webpage, coloradobioethics.org. Thank you.
Thank you all.